Hello everybody, so I've come to Hatfield House to talk to you about Elizabeth becoming queen, because it was in the grounds of Hatfield House that she discovered that she was queen on the 17th of November 1558. Now, Elizabeth was an unlikely queen, really, in that if you think about her childhood, so she was born with, big pomp and circumstance, but there was no hiding the fact that it was a massive disappointment that her father, Henry VIII, had broken with Rome. He'd gone through 6 years of real disruption for the country, but he saw it as for himself, in order to marry Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother. And then Elizabeth was born a girl instead of, what surely should have been a boy. She was christened Princess, which means heir to her father's throne. But at the age of 2, with the downfall of her mother Anne Boleyn and Anne Boleyn's execution, Elizabeth's status was reduced to merely the Lady Elizabeth. She was stripped of her household, and she began living in the household of either her sister or here with her brother Edward VI. She did actually share some of his education and some of their childhood together. Obviously, that was a bit later on, after Edward had been born via Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. During the reigns of her half-siblings, Edward VI and Mary I, Elizabeth had been implicated in various rebellions or scandals of the time. So under Edward VI, Elizabeth found herself prisoner, kept under house arrest at Hatfield for was she not involved in the Thomas Seymour scandal? Now, Thomas Seymour was Edward VI's uncle. He was the younger brother of Edward Seymour, who had become Lord Protector, so he was ruling a council in place of Edward while Edward was a minor. And obviously they were both brothers of Edward's mother, Jane Seymour. Well, Thomas Seymour was just as ambitious as his brother Edward was, but didn't have the position, and he looked for other ways to get that. And he had thought about marrying Elizabeth, but that was vetoed. He in fact married Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, so his widow effectively, and they had been married, and Elizabeth had lived with them for a time. Now, Thomas seemed to not have given up on his ideas of seducing Elizabeth, and there are many accounts of him doing things that we would find now to be they were obviously disturbing to her at the time. We would probably class them as some sort of sexual abuse now. He would go into her room before she was awake. He would smack her on the bottom. There was a very strange incident that happened with Catherine Parr. Catherine was obviously really taken with Thomas Seymour in a kind of obsessive way that she saw no wrong in him, because this incident is one that demonstrates it. She held Elizabeth while Thomas ripped her skirts or slashed her skirts, which is just bizarre. So, but because of these incidents, because of this interaction with Thomas Seymour, when Thomas was basically getting too big for his boots in the court of Edward VI, Elizabeth was implicated. People spread rumours they were secretly married or she was pregnant by him. And at Hatfield House, there is a letter in Elizabeth's own hand to the court, to her brother, saying, basically, let me come to court. Let me show you I'm not pregnant by him. I have nothing to do with him. And that's inside at Hatfield House. She was allowed to come to Hatfield House in 1558 earlier than 1558, but when Mary I believed she was pregnant. She believed she was securing her line. She believed she was going to keep the Catholic faith in England. So everything was fine, and Elizabeth was allowed to come to Hatfield House, where she'd spent a lot of her childhood, so she was very familiar with this area, and she did enjoy being here. She was in the grounds of Hatfield House when she found out she was queen. Mary I had died in the early hours of the 17th of November 1558, probably of a tumour, which had started with her believing she was pregnant, but actually her pregnancy turned out to be a false pregnancy and was likely the tumour that eventually did kill her. So behind me you can see what Elizabeth would have recognised the building that's behind me. This is the Great Hall of Hatfield House. Most of the house was destroyed in the reign of James I and rebuilt. And the Great Hall behind me remained as stables for the new house, and remained so until in the sort of state of a stables until 1915, when it was renovated and brought back to its original state. It's a great place to come. There's some brilliant artifacts from Elizabeth's life in there. One of which, so let's talk about Elizabeth's heritage. So Elizabeth obviously was technically a bastard. Her parents' marriage, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII's marriage, had been annulled. Her mother had been found to be, supposedly adulterous, incestuous, and so Elizabeth was disgraced from that side. However, her father was still Henry VIII. But when she became queen, there were many who believed she shouldn't have been queen. And so their lineage became top importance, proving that the Tudors were the rightful heirs, that each one of them in turn was the right one to be taking over the throne. And Elizabeth was no different. Elizabeth had this uphill battle to climb more than any of them, maybe since her granddad, Henry VII. And inside Hatfield, there is I suppose like a family tree, but it links her back supposedly to a huge, just an amazing collection of people, either real or now we know to be not real. So she is supposedly linked to King Arthur. She is related back to some of the Roman emperors, Noah. So you get biblical characters in there, and right back to Adam and Eve. So this lineage is it's a fascinating piece of parchment to look at, because you just keep looking through and you're really all the way up. I'll list for you under this video the people that I remember when I have a look at my notes that she was linked to on there. It's really interesting. That's something you must see.